Good afternoon. I am Nakia Wright, the CEO of the Chicago Sun-Times, and I'm here to welcome you to today's webinar event, Building Collective Power: How to Mobilize the Black and Latinx Community to Advocate and Advance Their Civic Agendas. The Sun-Times is honored to serve as the co-host for this, the third and final installment of a webinar series developed and organized by the Chicago Community Trust. In 2019, the Trust launched a new strategy that aims to address the root causes of the pervasive inequities that have resulted in the massive and still growing racial and ethnic wealth gap. The first two webinars discuss strategies for growing the household wealth of communities of color and how to catalyze neighborhood investment. Today's discussion will address another equally important issue: how the residents of Chicago's often overlooked and ignored neighborhoods and communities can make themselves seen and heard. The scars of social, economic, and racial injustices remain raw for many Chicago residents and communities. Even though all people are ostensibly equal on paper, in practice, there remains a wide and still widening gap between the promise of equality and the reality of inequity. The region's Black and Latinx communities have waited long enough for justice. For those of you who do not know, the Chicago Community Trust has spent more than a century working to improve the lives of all residents of the Chicago region and to creating a more equitable environment in which every person, regardless of race or ethnicity, can thrive. Creating the conditions necessary for this to happen requires residents to be more than passive recipients of civic and government resources. They must be active participants with an actual seat at the table. According to the Trust's CEO, Dr. Helene Gayle, this can only be achieved if resident-led agendas are given the resources and support they need to be manifested. For the Sun-Times, this is our mission. Our partnership with the Chicago Community Trust over the last year has allowed our loyal readers and the greater Chicago community to benefit from the knowledge, decisions, and legislation directly tied to social and environmental injustice. As the Chicago Sun-Times commits to getting back to the basics of being the voice of record for this city, truth ambassadors when facts are under siege, and partners in the fight for building more equitable and sustainable communities, we welcome you to this event. I look forward to hearing from our exceptional group of panelists about how community voices can help to shape and advance the vision of a thriving, equitable, and connected Chicago region. As moderator of today's webinar, Dr. Gayle will now introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Gayle?
Thanks so much, Nakia. And it's wonderful to be with all of you today and really excited for this panel. I want to first start by thanking the staff at the Chicago Community Trust for helping to pull this together, and particularly recognize Daniel Ash, who leads this strand of our work on collective power. So let me just introduce briefly our panelist, Jawanza Malone, who is the executive director for the Wieboldt Foundation, and he was just appointed into this position about a month ago. So this is a new role. We're really pleased to have you here. The Wieboldt Foundation was founded in 1921, making it one of the oldest private foundations in the Chicago area. For the last 50 years, its grant making has focused on community organizing and activism across the Chicago region. Jawanza was most recently the executive director for Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, also known as COCO, the largest Black-led community-based community-based organizing organization in Chicago, and he served there for in a variety of capacities for about 23 years. Next is Cathy Cohen, who is the David and Mary Whitten Green Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. She's the author of The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics and Democracy Remixed, Black Youth and the Future of American Politics. She is the founder and director of two projects, the Black Youth Project and Gen Forward, a bi-monthly survey of young adults that pays attention to how race and ethnicity shape how respondents experience and think about their world. So those are our two Chicago-based panelists. And we have with us Mark Morial, who is the president and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. Mark has been described lots of ways. Here it says that he has been described to possess street smarts and boardroom savvy. So he goes, spans the gamut. He also served, as many people know, as the mayor of New Orleans and the president of the US Conference of Mayors. And he's a leading voice on the national stage for the battle for jobs, education, housing, and voter rights equity, and really is an important voice at this particular moment in history. So we are thrilled to have you with us, Mark. We know you're all over the place, zooming everywhere. So we're happy that you zoomed into Chicago to be with us today.
Love Chicago.
Last but not least is Cecilia Munoz, who is the Vice President of Public Interest Technology and Local Initiatives at New America, a DC-based organization dedicated to renewing the promise of America. And in all truth and transparency, I happen to chair the board of New America, so I'm thrilled to have Cecilia here with us. She has spent several months on loan from New America, helping with the Biden transition, particularly domestic and economic policy. She has deep roots in the civil rights community and served for 8 years in the Obama White House, where she was the first Latina to direct the White House Domestic Policy Council. Prior to that, she was the senior vice president and for the Office of Research, Advocacy, and Legislation at the National Council of La Raza, the largest Latinx advocacy organization in the United States. But I will also highlight that she started her career here in Chicago with Catholic Charities. So everybody has a little bit of Chicago in them. So let me just begin. And I know the time is going to fly. So I want to just ask everybody quickly, you know, this is about collective power. And that's not necessarily a household word for everybody. What does collective power mean to you? And maybe I'll start with you, Jawanza.
No, thank you. Collective power is really a real simple concept. If we think about power as the ability to manifest the ideas that's in your head, then collective power is about being able to create a common vision among a group of people that you then work to successfully realize. And so this is, you know, why people form organizations, is why organizations form coalitions, and why we have nation states, right? The idea is that there are strength in numbers, and this belief really sets the playing field that we all operate under. And now I just want to quickly add, I want to allow other panelists to get in here, but when we think about community organizing, you're talking about collective power, right? Community organizing exists to realize collective power. And so I'll pause there.
Great, that's very clear, thank you. Cecilia.
So I think Jawanza really said it extremely well. I mean, collective power is that's the lever that we use to move our democracy, right? We own this thing together. And the idea that we can work collectively should be the tool that we use in order to move our democracy forward. I think too frequently we assume that there are other locuses of power that are maybe more powerful than we are, and therefore we don't bother. But the fact of the matter is, I think collective action is the means through which we can leverage our democracy and move the country forward.
Cathy?
Yeah, I mean, we're all going to say similar things. Of course, I mean, not of course, but, you know, collective power for me is kind of the gathering of groups of people based on some sort of solidarity, right, to share the resources that they already have and secure needed resources to address, right, concerns, experience, and aspirations of that group. I guess I'd make maybe 3 quick points. One is that solidarity is important because people need to be seen. They need to understand that what they experienced and endured wasn't just them, but others, right? So kind of solidarity provides visibility. That collective power is different from collective mobilization. And what I mean is with collective power, you're trying to sustain something. You're trying to build power. And while it's powerful to go to the streets, I think collective power often is rooted in a kind of organizational formation. And then the last thing is just collective power, I don't think is static, right? It's it deepens every time people learn more, they expand their analysis and they work together. It expands and contracts, but it's always kind of changing. And our goal is not just to build collective power, but to sustain collective power.
Great. Mark.
Thank you very much. I'll just say amen and echo to all that's been said, but I was going to use and forgive me, a sports analogy about a demonstration of collective power. So in the 1960s and 70s, the University of Southern California had a play called Student Body Right or Student Body Left. The essence of the play is that both guards pulled, two running backs ran behind those guards. The quarterback pitched the ball back to a running back and got in front and blocked. And effectively, the ball carrier had a wall of 6 people blocking in front of them, going in the same direction. And to me, the essence of the opera is the operationalizing of collective power, which is a plan and then people working in unison towards a goal, working in unison towards one simple goal. I'll use that analogy. Another quick analogy is, if you ever look at the way geese fly, they fly in a V flock. But if you watch them closely, they fly together, and the goose in the front, the geese in the front, when that geese gets tired, they drop back, assume a flank position, and another geese goes to the front because the person in the front has to fly with the greatest resistance of the wind. So those are just some examples of what is collective power. It's got to be towards an objective, with the geese there, if you will, migrating. In the sports analogy, they're trying to move the ball forward. So that's my, quote, examples of collective power.
That's great. And what several of you all commented on was the importance, one, of having a goal, and two, that these things are not static, that they change, and that sustaining is an important part of it. I'd love to hear anyone who would like to comment on this challenge of sustaining, which I think we all grapple with. When we go back to the summer and protests post George Floyd, et cetera, we had a real outpouring. But I think the question that everyone asked was, how do we sustain this, to make this a movement, to really build that collective power? So I'd love to hear people's comments on how we move to sustaining these movements, and what are some of the sustaining the collective power, and what are some of the challenges to actually being able to sustain it? Cathy, you look like you got a thought there, so I'll move to you.
A thought. We'll try with a thought, and I'll try to be brief. As I said in the opening, I think that organizational formation is critical to sustaining collective power. What do I mean? I mean that we have to think about what is the kind of movement or civic infrastructure of communities that allow not only for them to come together once, but to kind of build power over time. So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we investing in established organizations and providing resources to seed new organizations, right? But I think we have to think about the ecosystem that allows for collective power. And I'll sum up soon and let others jump in. But if you look at the work, for example, of Barbara Ransby, when she's talking about the movement for Black lives, she details the kind of multiple levels of organizations that lead to sustaining movements and building movements, right? There are, of course, organizing organizations that are about base building, but there are also intermediary organizations that provide support to those organizations and help to develop leadership. There have to be kind of civic and media organizations that are about investigation. There have to be organizations that think about data, right? So I think sometimes when we're talking about sustaining movements, we think about an organization as opposed to how do we build and invest in an ecosystem of movement-ready communities. And I think that's how we sustain power, right? We build out organizations that are committed to magnifying and amplifying the voices, decisions, and needs and aspirations of communities that are usually marginalized and silenced.
Let me ask Jawanza maybe to comment, because you joined a foundation that has been funding community organizing for decades. I know you just joined, but tell us a bit about what Wieboldt has learned and what you have learned in your own experience about this building of the ecosystem and how important it is and what goes into that.
No, I just want to add to what Cathy said, because I think she identified so many key elements of it. To do this, I want to point out two examples of collective power. One is a little controversial given this moment in history we're in, but when you think about the founding of this country, that's an example of collective power. It was, in fact, an organizing campaign. We don't think about it that way, but that's exactly what it was, right? When we think about the 13 colonies, right? And how a group of businessmen of the era did not want to pay taxes back to Britain. They organized themselves as the Sons of Liberty, and they created messaging around why they should not have to pay taxes back to Britain. And they began to get other people in the 13 colonies to buy into this notion, right? And so the idea of having a vision for the future that allows everybody to see where they fit in is key to being able to offer sustainability, right? Because these are often protracted struggles that we're involved in, right? You think about the length of time for the Revolutionary War. It didn't happen overnight. And in fact, from the birth of the Sons of Liberty to the Revolutionary War was a significant period of time. And so you had to have people who was able to see their future wrapped up in the birth of a new republic, right? And similarly, when the parents of the Diet High School found out that their school was closing, they began to assemble, right? And figure out what is it they wanted to see for the community institution in their neighborhood. And obviously it was counter to what elected officials and the school district wanted. And so they began to wage battle, right? And they began to push this vision for a different future than what they had experienced. And after a 34-day hunger strike, they were able to win that school, right? And so while that's an extreme action, it was only possible. The only way those 12 people were able to hold each other through those 34 days of starvation was that they all had a vision for what they were fighting for. And I think that's how you really get to sustainability.
Yeah, Cecilia.
Yeah, so I'm just super excited by the point that Jawanza just made, and by connecting it to what Cathy said, that at some level you need resources for an infrastructure so that there are, as Cathy says, like organizations that are providing the data, people that are doing storytelling, like people that are performing different elements of what a movement needs. But Jawanza's point is exactly right. It's the strategy and the goal is tremendously important to understand exactly where a movement is heading and specifically what it is that it's trying to achieve, and reinforcing for the participants in the movement the victories, and for that matter the losses on the way to getting there. I think is essential to sustainability. I think we've all experienced these moments where we all see something clearly at the same time and we're able to come forward and express it. But the glue is really the organization, which, like, the Movement for Black Lives had been invested in and had been organizing for years before last summer. And so they were equipped for that moment in which we all saw what we saw. So the infrastructure was important, but also just clarity of purpose and being able to communicate back to people, even if as you have small victories along the way, that's essential to helping people recognize that their power is accomplishing things. And I say this as someone who's, I've had a stint in government and I've been watching the folks going into the new administration in Washington. People in this country are about to have a lot of contact with their government, right? Either because, God willing, they're going to get vaccinated, or because they're getting resources from the CARES Act or some of the other things that Congress has passed. The more people understand as they, hopefully access the things which the government intends for them, that this is something which has come from their government. It's something that they fought for and won, and that continuing to fight is what actually can get us to a place where the government is producing more for particularly, marginalized communities. The more you can connect those things in people's minds, the more they understand and can leverage their role in this democracy. And that's really what we need in order to move us in the direction that I believe we need to move.
Mark, I want to ask you a question. You run an organization that itself, considered a collective power organization, but you also get lobbied a lot from grassroots. Grassroots people work to see how they can get their voice in through the Urban League. Could you kind of make that connection between the local and the national, and why the local?
Sometimes I find that people who operate at the grass tops promote and elevate false narratives of conflict between people based on what organizational hat they wear. One of the things you note if you know local communities that lots of people wear multiple hats. They're in multiple organizations. They might be on a tenant council, but they might be an Urban League employee. They might be a member of the NAACP and an Urban League volunteer and active in their church. They might be be a part of Black Lives Matter and be a National Urban League young professional. And people who don't really understand the ecosystem of the communities don't understand that there's a synthesis between those who are active in the community amongst each other. So I'm very affirming of the growth of the civic ecosystem. I do not believe that any one organization, any one set of organizations, any one type of organization can chop all the wood of hate, discrimination, and structural racism in the forest in which we live in to be able to move things forward. And when we see the grassroots communities and we see the level of interactivity and the level of coalition building in many, many communities, there's friction and there's debate and there's discussion and sometimes a little bit of finger pointing, but essentially there's a broad consensus of what the problems are. There's a broad consensus as to what the solutions are. I would just add this in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and the point at which we're in. I worry and am concerned that the moment is a moment and not a movement because of the impatience of the American people, the impatience and the desire for quick wins, easy victories. When something moves from the front pages of the newspaper, it is over. The front page of trending on Twitter, it's over. And to build the sustainability around this, the activation that began in the civic ecosystem has to find its way into the more established institutional ecosystems, higher education, corporations, federal, state, and local government. Because if we talk about institutional change in America, those are the institutions we have to change. Government, business, higher ed, the media, across the board. And so to the extent that this great movement of people and consciousness is going to be sustained, it sustains itself within the community of activists, but it infiltrates and immerses into other, if you will, institutions in American life.
Thank you. Cathy, let me pivot to you for a minute. You do a lot of work with young people, with millennials. A lot of us are hanging our hat on the fact that this next generation is the answer. I'd love to get some of your thoughts and maybe even responding to some of the things that Mark said.
Right.
What is the picture for millennials? We saw them rise up, if you will, post George Floyd, but and all of us hope that the next generation sees the world in a better way than perhaps we do. Talk about the work that you're doing and where you see millennials fitting into this picture, and should we or should we not have hope that they actually are going to do this differently?
Well, you know, I don't want to speak for millennials, but I will say that, you know, we field a survey of young people 18 to 36. We have millennials and Gen Zers as are part of that. And I have the honor and pleasure of working with a number of young activists, both in Chicago and across the country. So I feel like I can say a little bit about what I'm seeing. I guess in line, for example, with this discussion, I think one of the things I would note is the kind of deep commitment young people seem to have to collective power based on organizing and nonviolent protests. What do I mean? When we survey young people and we say, what are the top 3 ways to make racial progress in this country? African American, Latinx, and Asian Pacific Islander young adults name organizing, and they name nonviolent protests as 2 of their top 3 choices. When they do name elections, it's at the state and local level, not national elections. So I think you see generations who are committed to building power collectively and through organizing, and who want to facilitate accountability, right? They are committed to local elections because they can hold local officials more accountable. I'll make 2 quick more points. The second point, I guess, is that I think like most Americans, the American public, we find a deep alienation and skepticism towards traditional political institutions, right? This is especially true for young folks of color who've experienced directly in their lives the abuses of the police, the expansion of prison industrial complex, right? The underfunding of their neighborhood schools. We can go on and on. But it is clear, in fact, that they don't trust those institutions to change their lives. And I'll go further. They don't trust elected officials, whether those elected officials come from their neighborhood or not, because these are young people who've now grown up with elected officials of color who didn't substantially change their conditions. I think the third and final point, though, I'll make is that this is a generation or generations, at least from our data, that suggests they really are rethinking democracy and see the state as being a place for expansion, not retraction, right? So majorities of young adults support the universal basic income benefit. They believe the government should guarantee a job to all those who want to work. Majorities of young people of color believe the government should provide reparations for African Americans, right? They believe in the protests this summer. They believe the protests will have a long impact. And actually, majorities support divesting parts of the budget of police departments, right? And reinvesting those. So I think in terms of how we want to think about this generation, right? They have lived the restructuring of our economy. They've experienced the faults of the state, and they're investing in what they believe to be the most effective means, which is collective power, right? Mobilization. Now, that's not to say, as Mark just mentioned, that in fact, they have some naive understanding that only going into the streets will change democratic processes and outcomes. But I think they're less invested and more skeptical that just participating in a democracy, just voting, will change their conditions, right? They are looking for transformational change, not reforms. And that might be, we might think that's too much to ask, but in fact, I think that's the right way to go. And so I think organizations, as Cecilia said, if you think about the movement for Black Lives, that has over 100 organizations doing organizing, as Jawanza pointed out, I think there's real hope in terms of the generations. So I'll stop.
So, and I'm going to sprinkle in some of the questions that I see coming in the chat that maybe follows on this, and anybody who wants to answer. You know, we have all, young people tend to be idealistic, you know, across the generations. There is often the concern that as we move into the workforce, as we develop our families, start our families, that we get co-opted. How do we guard against being co-opted, if you will, and keeping people feeling like it is worth fighting for these issues as we go through what is a normal phase in development of thinking more about security? Be interested to hear anybody's comments on why we think this moment might be different, or if it's, or maybe it's not.
I mean, I'll dive in. I think there is, I mean, in some ways this relates, Helene, to the question you asked before about sustainability, right? We have to create structures that allow for room for people to be advocates and also parents, and or people to be, you know, advocates while also holding down a job and raising kids and doing the things you do in a life, so that it's actually, you know, a sustainable life's work, and not just something that you do at a time in your life where you might have more capacity, more liberty to engage in a certain kind of way. I think that's part of the challenge. But I also think we're in a moment where we're more easily seeing the connection between, frankly, our kids' lives or our grandkids' lives and the movements that we're working on. You know, the folks working on climate change, I think, are an excellent example. That's really about literally the world that our kids are going to inherit, the world that our grandkids are going to inhabit. I increasingly see that with respect to our conversation about race and ethnicity as well. This notion that, I mean, the generation that I come from, you know, inherited some pretty big Black-brown divides, for example. Those aren't gone, but boy, are they different in the next generation than they were compared to the generation that trained me. Like, we understand our struggle. In fact, you know, Mark Murray Allen, his relationship with my former boss, Janet Murguia from Unidos US, is an excellent example of that. When the two of you became leaders of your civil rights institutions, I think around the same time, and were able to push back some of the divisions that your predecessors had between you. And I think the generation that's coming up after us understands how these things are related to each other, how our struggles are related to each other, even better than we did. So it feels to me like we're making progress, and that progress helps us be more effective collectively across some of the divides, which you know, I don't want to suggest that they're gone. They're not gone, but we really are making progress, and we really are doing it in such a way that we are connecting what we're trying to achieve to our children's lives, to our grandchildren's lives.
Elaine, let me make. I'd like to make a point, and that, and I think we may be talking around this a little bit. And I'll tell you what makes this time different in my mind, and why we have to think very strategically. You know, I grew up in the South. When I was in high school, the Ku Klux Klan had an organizing effort in my high school. Several of us were harassed by phone calls, hate literature being placed in our lockers. It went on for almost a year. And they had an organizing effort going in multiple high schools in New Orleans at that time. That was then, but this is now. But what have we witnessed? We've witnessed the effort to normalize, with the #1 leader, champion, and cheerleader, the Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States, the philosophy of white supremacy and hate, in an effort to make it the government's operating philosophy. That is different. That is different, which is why we cannot believe that we can sustain a movement outside of elected politics. If you surrender the power of the state, you surrender the complete power of the state by non-participation or cynicism or contempt, then we are on the brink. And never before in my life did I ever have a sense in this country of how totalitarian regimes rise. They rise and become permanentized. And what makes these times different is that threat and that reality. And January 6th, that's different. I'm from the South. Having the Ku Klux Klan run around, having small town Southern county sheriffs and big mouth racist legislators who are one vote in a legislature running around spewing racism and hatred and white supremacy. That's one thing. To have it coming from the President of the United States, that's different. That's new. Now, you get into a long debate of where it surfaced, how it came from, but the reality is we have to understand, we're close to it, that we've witnessed a unique differential threat to every single thing I've worked my life for and I believe in. A direct threat, and the power of the idea that the power of the state has embraced in rules and regulations and policies and actions, in rhetoric, and trying to normalize it and officialize it, is really a clear and present threat to the future of this country. And so this is different, not only because of how we responded, it's also different because of the context in which we responded. And I think about that because sometimes it raises in me, how do we effectively move forward? How do we effectively create, a movement? And we have to continue to contextualize where we are. I was active in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, the Obama era. I've never seen anything like that, what we witnessed. And it shudders when my 88-year-old mother, who grew up in segregation, says, this is worse or as bad as I've seen it in 50 to 60 years. And I take it at heart. So I put that out there to say that when we discuss collective power, we're also talking about trying to build collective power against a wall of collective power. That we're not operating in a vacuum. We're not operating on a playing field where there's not people coming at us, trying to cut us down, trying to delegitimize us. And we are in a battle for the future of the nation, soul of the nation, the legitimacy of the nation, the values of the nation, the set of democracy. We have to convey that broader context in a historical sense to the people who we know embrace what we're saying.
Well, I think as I'm looking at the chat box, I think that there is a strong sense that this is a different moment. And to your point, I think we need to keep that in mind as we think about how do we organize, what are we organizing both against, but also what are we organizing for? And so I think it's a really important point. Let me switch gears a little bit and turn to you, Jawanza. You now are at a foundation and you were working at a community organization where you had to ask for money from a foundation. There have been a lot of questions in the chat about the role that funders play, both positively and negatively, and how funders and their short-term thinking for something that is a long-term issue may be counterproductive, even though they may be thinking that they're a positive force. Say a little bit, being on both sides of this now, what's the role that you think philanthropy can play, and how are they positively playing it? How are they negatively playing it? And where would you like to see philanthropy go related to this issue of building the ecosystem for collective power?
I think philanthropy plays or can play a very similar role as our elected officials. I mean, just following Mark's comments, as a former elected official, like I hear with a certain ear, right? I think that, yeah, having a white supremacist in the White House had this sweeping impact across the country. We have to simultaneously recognize the power of these little chiefs in our communities. who belong to a different party who have had, to some degree, the same impact, right, on our everyday lives, right? When we think about the closure of schools, closure of hospitals, abuses across the board, I mean, these people are the ones who were the perpetrators of these crimes, right? And so I think all that has to live in the same space. So the role of philanthropy, I mean, again, throughout the history, right, they've also been on both sides. And so I think the reality is that philanthropy will always have more money at their disposal than government. And what opportunities does that create within philanthropy? You know, I would say that the nimbleness, the ability for philanthropy to be much more responsive in an immediate way. I mean, we just saw this last year, how much money began running out of the door in response to the COVID crisis, right? Like, there is an opportunity there that I think gets missed. When we look back at, this may not be the best example, but when we look at the opportunity zone, right? Where you had this tax haven that was intended to be able to create good across the country. What we saw were those same investors that this tax haven was set up to attract, to do some social good. They began to make demands on the people for a greater, above market return on their investment, right? You look at, any investment, right? You're going to get 3%, 10%, whatever, on top of the return that was guaranteed virtually from the opportunity zone. They were looking at, upwards of 20% or more, right? And so we have to, I think, wrestle with the fact that the laws that govern this country are intended to benefit a subset of the population, right? It just is. And how does philanthropy be able to sort of exist outside of that to be able to create opportunity, to be able to help seed development in communities that otherwise would not be able to benefit from the capital that they need to grow these sorts of things? I think similarly, we have to make sure that the people most impacted are at the table, right? We cannot center the growth and development of communities by having an antagonistic approach to those same people. That's ridiculous. But again, we see government doing that in many instances, right? And I can, I'll just end because I see Cecilia wants to jump in here. If we haven't learned anything from last year, it's that we cannot sit outside of the neighborhoods in which we live and make decisions. We have to hear the pain that is being experienced on these streets. We have to understand the day-to-day impact of decisions that are made in the halls of power. And when someone comes to the door and says, what you are doing is hurting me, we can't turn a deaf ear to that. Because one, historically, that's what's happened, and look what it's got us. And in contemporary times, we've continued to follow that same practice, and look at what it's got us. And so we have to begin doing things differently. And I argue, again, that it begins through centering the people most impacted. That's what philanthropy can model for government, and government can take it to scale. But it has to begin, and I argue it hasn't begun.
Thank you. Cecilia, you look like you had a comment.
I did. I wanted to start with amen, because I completely agree with what Jawanza just said. And I wanted to add that I think philanthropy in general is still too afraid of advocacy and still too afraid of collective action, and tends to stay in spaces that are good, that are quantifiably good work to do, but they aren't this work. And I really strongly believe, and I think kind of what we've been through in the last 4 years, and especially in the last year, I think strengthens the case that it is worth investing in collective action. It is worth investing in organizing. It is worth investing in power building in order to shift the very structures that Jawanza was just talking about. That there's, we should be able to draw a direct line between where money is going to people organizing and setting the kinds of goals that we talked about, and influence on the government and who ends up in government and what government ends up doing. Like that's the chain that you can create, which can in turn create change at scale. And the problems that we face are not gonna, change with kind of small grants for individual projects in the kind of tunnel vision way that is kind of more comfortable for philanthropy. And, I think, and I say this as someone who sits on a number of foundation boards, and, the good ones are starting to think about how to meet this moment and are understanding that this moment is different. And I think investing in advocacy, investing in the kind of leadership that built the movement for Black Lives, for example, is one of the roads to the kind of change at scale that we need.
Cathy, go ahead. And then I'm going to start wrapping up because I'm looking and the clock is ticking. And I got a couple more questions I want to get out from the audience, but please, Cathy, and
I'll be very, very brief because Jawanza, they said it all. Other than I just want to emphasize the difference between, and I think, I sit on the Phil Foundation. I'm very proud of the work that we do, but to differentiate between, right, building a civic infrastructure, even in communities of color, versus movement advocacy and building and committing to organizing. And I think that, as Cecilia maybe was suggesting, that some organizations or foundations are willing to go towards civic infrastructure. Yes, I'm going to give money to organizations in communities of color, which I think is important. But how do we begin to really support movement advocacy? And I think we see foundations like the Wood Foundation designating money for that, Wieboldt, Crossroads. There are some organizations that do that work. But to really kind of push and think strategically with folks from those communities at the table, what is needed to move an agenda, to move a campaign. So,
yeah. No, thank you. And I would just add that, when we moved to make collective power one of our core pillars, there was a lot of, skepticism, I guess I would say, both on part of, staff as well as our board, et cetera. It has now shown to be one of the most dynamic aspects of our portfolio. And I think a lot of the things that you all are talking about just highlight why it is such a critical part to other things that we may do that people think of as more tangible. So thank you. Cecilia, I just want to move to ask you a question about innovation, because a lot of questions have come up. You head New America's work in this way. How can technology be an enabler for some of this? And what are some of the things that you're actually thinking about in your work at New America?
So I think we are underutilizing technology, but I also want to caution against the notion, which is frequently the first thing that comes up when you talk about applying technology to this space. I think of this as the app that's going to save America phenomenon. Like, there is no app that's going to save America, and it's not a matter of applying technology to a problem and to kind of turbocharge our ability to solve it. What I've learned in the context of doing the public interest technology work that I've been doing now at New America for 4 years is that the skills of technologists can be applied, but in ways, but they're strongest when you're applying them in partnership with the people who are doing the organizing and the people who are trying to make change. And ideally, those are the people who should be wielding and designing the technology in the first place. Like, we're not at that place yet. But one of the structures that we need to build is essentially create capacity within our own communities, rather than expect that somebody's going to come from the Silicon Valley and maybe be our partner and maybe help us do a thing. There's no reason, there's no magic to this. There's no reason that the communities themselves can't be wielding this skill set in order to use technology in the application of advancing our goals. And if you do what Jawanza said earlier, which is put the people who we are talking about at the center of technology and the use of technology, and frankly, use the same techniques that the Silicon Valley uses, you know, to create the thing that I'm going to be addicted to next week that I never imagined today. Like, right, using those techniques, the techniques that are focused on what the Silicon Valley calls the user, and using that to focus our work on the people who are going to benefit from the thing that we're trying to do, will make us much more effective in designing that thing and ultimately realizing our goals. So I think there is a lot of room for innovation, but we should not think of it as something that somebody else is going to do. We should be thinking of it as something that we are building the capacity in our communities to do.
So I want to ask about a specific way in which collective power has been on the front burner, and maybe direct this to you, Mark. You've talked a lot about police and police reform, and here in Chicago, you know, we've got ongoing issues around the relationship between police and communities. Could you say a bit from your experience how you feel this elevation of collective power can be a constructive force in thinking about how we, you know, build and reimagine our relationship to police safety?
Yeah, you know, you've asked a very important but also tough question, and it is, if you look at policing, which is generally always an issue that creates division and indeed emotions. You know, I can only look at my own experience in police reimagination and reform in New Orleans in the 1990s, where we took a police department which was, number one, corrupt, number two, brutal, number three, ineffectual in public safety, and transformed it over a period of 6 to 7 years. It required a grassroots organizing effort. It required alliances with the business community. It required me orchestrating as an elected official the actual changes and helping to build the public will towards it. And in some cases, the organizing effort, which I was involved in behind the scenes, sometimes it didn't appear that I was involved in, but I was very involved in it because I wanted the public pressure on the situation. I would say that the challenge now on many of these issues is to build cross-racial or multiracial coalitions around a set of issues. And to me, that will be the organizing principle of the future. How you can take issues of equity and justice, be it police, be it criminal justice, be it immigration, be it economic sustainability, and build coalitions that are broader than a single community. And I think that that can happen both at the local level and the national level. Cecilia mentioned the work that we've done with UNIDOS, but the truth is that at the national level, the Black, Latino, and Asian organizations work more closely together than ever before. Just because it's not on the front page of every social media, newspaper, and store doesn't mean it isn't happening, because sometimes we don't think we need to broadcast everything we do collectively, but the fact of the matter, we've got some operational respect and some collectivity. So I think on police reform is also very much a local issue, because there are different sets of circumstances and different sets of factions. But to change policing, you have to have community alignment, you have to have elected alignment, you gotta have a stiff back, because there's gonna be serious opposition to what you're trying to do. And it's extremely difficult. So maybe I partially answered the question, but I did the best I could.
Well, you at least said that it is possible, and you have seen it done, which is a important point. Let me just, this will be for everybody, last question, because as I said, the time was going to fly and it has flown, and Nakia will probably give me the hook, but I would be remiss if I did not talk about the role of the media Thank you very much for our partnership with Sun Times. Thank you for the aspirations that you have, Nakia and your team. But love to hear each of you say a word about the role that the media can play, both national media, but particularly hyper-local and local media, because we put a big focus on that. And I think, you know, this whole issue of how do we give community voice is an important aspect of this as well. So Jawanza, maybe I'll start with you.
Hey, that's a great question. I think that now more than ever, we need independent journalists who are not just automatically accepting what somebody says because they may have been elected to office or they got a bunch of money in their bank account, right? We need to interrogate what's happening behind the scenes. And it's tough, right? Because these different media outlets have different business models, right? You have some that are just a vehicle for advertisers. You got others who are really trying to answer some critical questions. You got others that have catering to a specific readership or viewership. You got others that have their own agenda they're trying to promote. I mean, stuff is all over the place, right? And so the issue is that we have to center, again, niche publications that understand they have a job to report the news that has impact on people's everyday lives, right? Just two quick stories. I promise you they'll be quick. There was a campaign I was involved in where we uncovered that the Chicago Housing Authority was stockpiling on average $100 million a year and hiding it from the federal government, like they were intentionally defrauding the federal government, hiding it as a depreciation line item in the budget they were submitting to HUD. I spoke to an editor at a local paper. He told me, because of course I was trying to get this out in the media, he told me that everybody knows CHA is corrupt. This isn't newsworthy. He wasn't going to run it, right? He's thinking about what is going to get eyes on the paper versus the impact that this story could have on the thousands of people who go without shelter in the city, who could have benefited from what we found at that time, $660 million that was just sitting, that wasn't going towards making sure that people were housed. There's a local publication, you know, sort of on the other side, who hound local elected officials when they take votes that go against what they campaigned on, right? Who say one thing and then do another, right? Because they're trying to make sure that we're clear on what the track record of these elected officials in particular is, right? Because we often forget that these people don't just materialize, but they have a track record that you can follow if you're paying attention. And so I think that that's the role of media, right? There is this symbiotic relationship between community organizing groups, right, and media outlets who can broadcast a message that we're trying to promote. Because a lot of this is about narrative change and being able to provide a counterweight to the 24/7 news coverage of, you know, this false narrative around meritocracy, this false narrative that, you know, Black people are bad, that poor people are the scourge of the country, right? That's being promoted constantly. And so where is sort of the different version of the story that's really talking about what's happening?
Great. We are actually past time, but I will give everybody, if you have 2 seconds that you want to say on this topic about media and giving voice. Otherwise, others? Anybody want to add anything? Okay. Thank you very much. I turn it back over to
Thank you.
Your final answer, I think, summed it up so lovely. So this has been fascinating. Thank you all for your incredible perspectives. This has been a wonderful, lively, we could go on for another hour, but thank you so much for the time that you spent. So Nakia.
Yes, I just want to echo that. Thank you so much for the distinguished panelists. That last question was so important because as the head of a media organization, that is something that we grapple with every day. I know that several people have just left because they have to get back to their Friday. So thank you very much for joining, and we hope to have something like this again soon.